Hi, this is Jen Rubin. I've got great news. I'm going to be appearing live with the one and only George Conway. Yes, at the 92nd Street Y in New York City, November 12th. Get your tickets now. You can go to the 92nd Street Y website, or you can go to politicon.com/tour. It's going to be wild. It's not often that me and my employer are in the center of a really big news story. In this case, it's the refusal of the Washington Post owner, Jeff Bezos, to endorse a presidential candidate. He joins the LA Times and USA Today and all of its affiliated papers in refusing to take sides in the most consequential election of our time. Let me say a few things about it. First of all, I do not believe the reason stated. I don't believe he has suddenly decided that we should endorse everybody except presidential candidates, and that of all the elections, this is the one to start with this new policy. We endorsed a presidential candidate in 2020, no problem. And I perceive this, and even if it's not intended, it is inevitably perceived as bending the knee to Donald Trump. At the worst possible moment, when democracy is on the line, you have a billionaire who has a business aside from the Post that does business with the federal government, deciding not to run afoul of a man who has declared war on democracy and on the free press. And I still find it absolutely inconceivable that someone who owns a newspaper would do this. First of all, the number of cancellations, and this is not inside information, it's been published elsewhere, is now up to 250,000. How could you not understand what the Washington Post means to the public? We are not only a reliable source of news, but people look to us because they care what we think on the opinion side. They want to have some moral clarity. They want to have some political clarity. And depriving them of that severs a bond and a level of trust that has been built up over decades. And it breaks my heart to read these emails expressing their love for the paper and, frankly, for my own work, but saying they cannot in good conscience continue to subscribe. How could you not understand the damage to the brand, what you were dealing with, what you were entrusted with when you make a decision like that? But nevertheless, that was the decision that was made. And I am equally troubled by the fact that the reason given was not candid, was not accurate. Why mess around? If you say, hey, I'm a businessman, I don't want to endorse anyone because I don't want to affect those businesses. Yeah, everyone will be aghast, but at least you'd be honest. At least you'd be taking responsibility. When a newspaper is forced to advance a bullshit explanation, how much more damage does that do to the Washington Post? But the problem goes well beyond Jeff Bezos and the Washington Post. It goes beyond the LA Times. It goes beyond USA Today. This is a matter of how free societies defend themselves against fascist threats. Today in the Washington Post, I interviewed a whole series of dissidents from different countries, including the great Garry Kasparov, chess champion and former Soviet dissident, to talk to them about what we call self-censorship or obedience in advance. In other words, without ever being censored, without ever being punished or threatened, people take it upon themselves not to offend power, to pull their punches. This is a horrible precedent because it allows those fascist forces not only to control the press, but to say, I didn't do anything. Wasn't me. I didn't repress the media. They just decided to write whatever they wrote. In other words, they get away with controlling the media and also not taking responsibility for suppressing a free press. That's the worst possible combination. And if you're a billionaire and you can't do it, you can't stand up to power, how do you think small businesses, how do you think ordinary people, how do you think civil society is going to react? They too are going to genuflect even before they're told to in order to keep the king happy. Now, in the big scheme of things, life will go on. The Washington Post will continue to publish. Hopefully, we'll have more elections. Hopefully, Kamala Harris will win. But as for me, I can say this has affected me in some really substantial ways. First of all, I am forever grateful to my readers and to all of you. I am deeply touched by the sense of loyalty and that I mean something in the lives of these people who are nevertheless canceling their subscriptions. And by the way, they should join us here on Jen Rubin's Green Room because they can still hear from me and they don't have to subscribe to the Washington Post. But I've been deeply affected. And as a result, I think I will be even more careful in what I write and say. Not careful in the sense of pulling my punches, but deliberate, well thought out, because people are listening and people care and people pay attention. That is a huge responsibility. And I'm really glad I was reminded of it this week, because I think it's easy for people who write to think they're writing for themselves or they're writing for their friends or their family member. No, I'm writing for people who read me, which I'm fortunate to have a large audience. And the other thing, I think, is the recognition that institutions are just people. The Washington Post doesn't run itself. American democracy doesn't run itself. It depends upon people. And if you don't have people of good character, of strong spine, of decency, you are going to lose the institutions that are necessary for a free society. And we have lost something this week at the Washington Post. The American media has lost something. I think the American people have lost something. And we're going to have to all figure out how to repair this damage, this gash that has been cut through the hearts of good reporters, good columnists, readers. And frankly, we've let people down around the world because dissidents in other countries look to America. They look to the American media to stand up to power. What do they think when a billionaire who owns the Washington Post shies away from conflict? So it's been a hard week. I won't mislead you. But in some ways, it's affirmed that we matter. In his very hard to swallow editorial, he suggested that there's some kind of inherent conflict between opinion and news. There is not. There is a great tradition in American media, which has been upheld at the Washington Post. Separation of church and state, we sometimes call it opinion and media, opinion and news, rather. We have maintained it, and people are entitled to both. People deserve both. People want both. And if you really think having an active opinion section makes you look biased, then you're in the wrong business. Then you need to let that part of the business go. If you really want to have no opinion section, well, I guess you can try to create a paper like that. I don't think it's going to work, but you can try. So, a lot to think about. With the heaters blasting in the fall and winter, finding the right temperature at night is a struggle we all face. It can make it so hard to fall asleep, but recently I found a way to sleep in perfect comfort all night long. Whether you sleep too hot or even too cold, My secret is using the thermoregulating, NASA inspired, silver infused bed sheets by Miracle Made. Their self cleaning, antibacterial bedding even prevents 99.7% of bacteria. So they stay fresher 3 times longer. That means 3 times less laundry. Thanks to Miracle Made, you'll stop sleeping on bacteria that can clog your pores and lead to breakouts and acne. They even eliminate bad odors. So your bed always feels freshly made. Life is much more comfortable with Miracle. Their temperature regulating, silver infused fabrics were inspired by NASA to give you maximum comfort no matter what the weather is like outside. Just picture yourself getting a better night's sleep every night. Plus, Miracle Sheets feel soft and luxurious without the high price of other luxury brands. They even feel nicer than bed sheets used by some five-star hotels. So you'll feel like you're on vacation every time you get into bed. Imagine you're, I don't know, in the south of France or maybe skiing in the Alps, wherever. So ask yourself, what part of dreamland will Miracle take you to? Miracle has a whole line of comfortable self cleaning bedding, pillowcases, and comforters. I know you'll love them. So, how do you get them? Go to trymiracle.com/greenroom to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whenever you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo, Green Room, at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product that it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/greenroom and use the code GREENROOM to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/greenroom to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. You can look for the link in the show notes. I hate to say it because, of course, I'm afraid of jinxing things, and I don't want a repeat of 2016. But I'm feeling okay about this election. And the reason is we have a much better candidate. Put aside the ideology, put aside even the money, put aside the economy, all of these big factors. If you just look at the two candidates, and that's how most voters actually make their decision, there's just no comparison. Kamala Harris has come across as smart, as likable, as quick, as witty, and Trump is being Trump, this disgusting, vile, really degenerating figure who only has insults, only has racism, cannot spew anything else, takes offense at everything. And really, do we want 4 more years of him? And that's why I think the turn the page thing really is the final message, which is, can we just be done with him? And I think Kamala Harris has figured out how to do this. And I think she's done a few things right. First of all, she has worked her butt off. If you look at her schedule, not just in the final weeks, but over the course of that campaign, first of all, she has a job, which is vice president. So she's had to be there for briefings and foreign leaders and all the rest. But she travels constantly. She does media. It's not just segue into various communities with niche media, but she does mainstream media, local media, ethnic media, in all kinds of platforms. She travels to these massive events, which take a long time to prepare for. It's enormous expenditure of effort and concentration. She does them beautifully at this point. She's working really hard, and Trump is not, because, as he said, he's exhausted. And the other thing, she's she's really likable. She really is. People warm to her because she is a very warm and engaging figure. Whether you see her one on one as she greets people, or whether you see her in a larger room, or you see her sitting down with Liz Cheney, she is a charismatic, nice, engaging, warm personality. And I think as people have gotten to know her, that's become more and more apparent. And also, I think she's run, in terms of ideology, exactly right. And that is, Americans like progressive politics in the domestic sphere. They like Social Security. They like programs that make drugs cheaper or housing cheaper. They may be culturally more conservative, but most of America is actually progressive when it comes to use of the federal government to do things they like, because that's what most people depend upon. So she has come out, yes, with specifics. This notion that she was vague or that she didn't have anything to say is preposterous. I have not seen as many detailed plans from a presidential candidate, particularly one who's only had a few months to run, than I've seen from her. And at the same time, she's run as this muscular, no nonsense, tough on crime, tough on the border, tough on the Ruskies kind of Democrat. And I love that. In my earlier days, that would be called a Scoop Jackson Democrat. He was a senator from the state of Washington, and he was really progressive on domestic issues, but he was a tough, cold warrior. And that really appeals to me. And I think it appeals to a lot of Americans. And the last thing I'll say about the election, and I think it's going to be important, not only in the presidential, but in the Senate, in the House, in state House races, all the way down the ticket, is the abortion issue. Republicans are the dog that caught the bus. They have been pining away to get rid of Roe v. Wade. Now that they've got it, it's a disaster. People hate it. It is creating a massive pro choice, pro freedom, pro women's lives coalition. When you have Liz Cheney in a sit down with Kamala Harris say, this is not right that we have a situation where women can't get health care. This has got to change. Then you've really captured the majority of the country. That's then a governing majority. And by elevating that, by making that personal, by making this an issue of freedom, and with Michelle Obama's help, making this about respecting women, women's lives, women's health, I think that is going to be a very, very successful tactic and issue for her. And if the early voting is right, and the electorate, once again, is disproportionately female, then I think she's going to win. And maybe it won't be as close as some of the polls have to say. That does not mean you don't have to do work. You got a little time left still. So volunteer, give some money, make sure you vote. Please vote early. It is so much easier for that campaign when they have those votes banked and they don't have to keep calling you on election day to make sure you've voted. And they have some assurance that they've got those votes in the bag if there's, I don't know, storm or some other natural disaster. They know you voted. So vote early. I did in Washington, D.C. And I got to say, I don't think I've ever been as pleased with my vote as I was this time. I voted for Republicans. I voted for Democrats. But this time I had the sense I was voting not only for history, but for decency, for democracy, and for someone who I like. She's just a good person. It's easy to forget because we've been so immersed in the campaign. But really, the big issue prior to the final stretch of the campaign was the Supreme Court. It's corruption, it's ridiculous evisceration of precedent, it's ridiculous tipping of the scales in Trump's direction on immunity and other issues. And it's not going away. Whether Kamala Harris wins or not, and I think she will, it's going to be around, and we got to deal with the court. the good news is that one of the smartest people in politics and a dear friend of mine, David Brock, has written a book about the Supreme Court, how it got to be the way it is, why it seems that the train is no longer being driven by Chief Justice John Roberts, and what we can do about it. The book is called Stench. What a great title. The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America. So I'm delighted to welcome David to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure. Now, I know books take a long time to write and there's a run up time. When did you start writing this book on the Supreme Court that is now so timely and so appropriate for the crisis in the rule of law that we face?
Yeah, well, thanks. So it was after the Dobbs decision came down, late summer of that year. I decided there was a story in the 40-year campaign waged by the right through the Federal Society and later some other groups to do what they did to overturn Roe. And I wanted to show kind of how it happened, what the machinery was behind it, the money, all of it. And then so I started working on the book. The Thomas gifts had not come out yet.
Right.
But in the spring, as I was finishing up my proposal, the Thomas gifts story started to come out. And that gave the book a little more sizzle and a sense of urgency. And it introduced another dimension, which is the ethical crisis at the court.
Yeah. And we're definitely going to get to that. Now, in the title of the book, you have it phrased as the Thomas Court.
Yes.
Do you think he is now sort of the governing oar rather than Roberts, who seems to have lost control of his own court? Is he now the driving the train here?
That seems to be what the evidence shows. So folks who followed the Dobbs decision in detail probably already know that Roberts tried to forge some kind of a compromise where he would uphold the Mississippi ban, but not go to the step of overturning Roe, and that there was at least speculation in the press that Kavanaugh and Barrett might be available for some kind of a compromise decision. Of course, then there was a premature leak of the decision, which seemed to lock the players in to the positions they were in, which probably was the purpose of the leak. And so we came out with essentially 5-4, but then Roberts sort of, signing on a little bit to make it 6. But I think that was the moment where he lost control of the court. And the evidence suggests since that I think lately on this immunity decision, it shows he's trying to reassert his authority. And so I do think for those couple of years, he's lost control. And then I think on the other front where he's lost control is not being able or willing to do anything to address the ethical problems at the court. And in fact, one little tidbit in my book is that the Judicial Conference of the United States, which governs all federal courts below the Supreme Court on ethics, rules and regulations. When the Thomas stuff really started to hit, there was some sentiment in there, even though they don't govern the Supreme Court, to say something, to step up. And because a lot of the federal judges are just embarrassed and outraged by what's going on. And Roberts stepped in and shut that down. And then he also oversaw kind of this sham effort to impose for themselves an ethics regime that's completely unenforceable. So I think he's a weak character in all this.
Yeah, it's so porous that apparently it allowed Thomas to consider and keep considering cases of the coup in which his wife played some kind of role, and allowed Alito to continue to hold on cases after his flag controversy or 2 flag controversies. So apparently this self-executing ethics regime doesn't stop them from doing anything they want to do.
No, absolutely not. So, right, there are the gifts and the lack of disclosure of the finances, but then on the second prong is the issue of recusal. and they're flagrantly violating that. And one thing that I would point out that is often lost in the debate is that there's rightly so a lot of conversation around having a an ethics regime with teeth for the Supreme Court. But the fact is that there are some laws on the books that Thomas is already violating. The Ethics in Government Act from 1978 requires his reporting of these gifts. And there are also federal laws requiring disclosure. So he's, in a sense, already, a criminal in my mind.
Yeah, and a couple of the senators have actually made a referral to the Justice Department. If we actually had an attorney general, something might happen with that. But so far, there's no evidence whatsoever that this attorney general is looking into it. He certainly has not appointed a special counsel, which would be the normal step, that one would take. So what is your theory of Thomas? Is he taking all this stuff just because he's a greedy guy, because he thinks he's entitled to it, because he kind of feels aggrieved after what happened to him in the confirmation? What's your kind of psychological take on why he's so corrupt?
Well, I think it's a thumb in the eye to all the critics. And I think it goes back to his the reception he had, negative reception in the civil rights community, going back to his original appointments in the Reagan administration, where he was, one of the few black conservatives,
Right.
and I think he resented that, and then it metastasized during the Anita Hill hearings. And in fact, Ginny Thomas is on the record shortly after those hearings saying that he owes nothing to these liberal groups going forward. And so I think that's an aspect to it. I did find a speech that he gave at one point where he talked about wanting to be rich, and that was all he wanted, not public service. So it may be that he wants it both ways, that he wants the public service and the, substantial but lower salary, and then feels entitled to take these gifts and doesn't give a damn about what the public or his longtime critics will say.
Right. So why has Roberts, do you think, kind of given in? He could, as the Chief Justice, go out and make a public statement, and I guess that Thomas could then embarrass himself by saying, no, no, no. You'd think he would be able to find 4 other justices, to kind of put this in effect. Why is he genuflected to Thomas on sheer corruption?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you're right that Amy Coney Barrett and Elena Kagan have both said in different forums that there needs to be something that addresses the situation. And I think even Barrett was putting a little light between herself and Thomas. Why Roberts has been so weak on this it's hard to say, but it just shows that he isn't taking the authority that he has, and why that is. Whether it's that it's such a contentious issue that he doesn't want the conflict, but he's sacrificing the reputation of the court, and he's sacrificing the so-called, he's so-called institutionalist. He's sacrificing his own reputation and the reputation of the court by putting up with this.
I think that's exactly right. He was always the institutionalist. Remember, he was going to preserve the sanctity of the court. He did a reversal on the ACA because he didn't feel comfortable that the court would strike down a very popular major program of the president. So in that case, he went the other way. But that seems to have kind of fallen away. And I have a theory about it. Let me see if you agree. And it came out in, I think, the immunity case. These guys are entirely cut off from reality. He thought he was doing some great thing on the immunity case, that he was kind of cutting it very fine and he was preserving the presidency, but at the same time allowing the prosecution. And when this enormous blowback happened, I think he was shocked. And I think this is almost an argument for term limits, that these people get there and they have no conception of what the public thinks, or they don't care what the public thinks, and they just talk to themselves. And I think he's just kind of out of it.
Yeah, I think he's gotten out of touch for
Uh-huh.
sure, and I think that's a right theory. Um, I think the other thing I might add is that it could be that the presence of the three Trump appointees sort of tipped the balance in his mind, and in an effort to kind of corral that, which was unsuccessful, he's given them leeway on these ethics questions.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good point. Democrats have not played the long game with the court. We've never been able to get people to vote on the court, although I think the last couple of elections arguably have been Dobbs elections. What do you think Democrats, we'll talk about the short term, but in the long term, need to do to either restrain, sort of block these efforts, which is really nothing more than corruption from the Leonard Leos of the world to craft an agenda, to craft cases, to install judges that they like, or to come up with their own system? What do you think the long game is for Democrats?
I think it has to be meaningful reform of the court, and I don't think it lies in, say, counterweight to the Federalist Society. I don't think that's going to work. It's kind of been tried and not really been very successful.
Right.
But I think the way, well, first of all, it's obvious that we have to elect Democrats to jam their circuits. That's the way, is through the ballot box. And then secondly, some meaningful reform, which you cannot get unless you have more Democrats in the Congress. And in fact, get rid of or have a carve out for the filibuster. So some of the ideas that have been bandied about are one, you've got to have that ethics code.
Right.
I mean, federal officials can't take more than a $50 lunch.
Right.
It's obscene, and they should just have that rule. I think that's what Congressman Raskin has proposed. And then I think a consideration seriously of expanding the court and of term limits. Expanding the court may be a step too far, but I think that's a starting point. And maybe you end up at term limits. But I think that's your starting point, and I think that that's the long term game for real change.
All right. Are you confident that, let's say, for sake of argument and for God willing predictions, that Kamala Harris is elected, there's a Democratic House, and narrowly there's a Democratic Senate? Do you think in this era, Democrats are prepared to do a carve out or do away with the filibuster?
Well, I think they may be. Yeah, I think that the time may be right. I mean, Sheldon Whitehouse has led the charge on this for a long time in a very effective way, I think. So I think there's, because of the just the level of outrage over the gifts and the lack of disclosure, that there's a public desire, I think, now. If you look
Yeah.
at all the polls, Clarence Thomas extremely unpopular. So now would be the right time, and it would be the first time that Democrats would really step up on this issue. As you said, there's a long history of the evangelical right voting on this, and Democrats ignoring it. And I think if they have the confidence of a victory, that's the moment to strike. And I think Kamala Harris has all the background to understand the issue in all its dimensions, and could back that up.
Absolutely. I think it's very helpful having a really skilled prosecutor in the White House. I think that is exactly how you have to kind of look at the presidency right now. You have to prosecute the case. And so long as we have an anti-democratic Republican Party, you kind of have to think of governance in those terms, which is make the case, force your point across, and if you get them to go along, fine, and if not, push them out of the way. What is your evaluation of this amazing campaign that, remember, only started in July? Taking off your legal hat, your book author hat, and putting back on your partisan Democrat hat.
Yeah.
What score would you give the campaign? How do you think they have done with what they have, with the state of the country, with the opponent they have, with the resources they have? How would you evaluate them?
Yeah, so I think honestly, I don't think the Harris campaign certainly has not made a misstep. They haven't laid
Mm-hmm.
a foot wrong, which
Yeah,
is pretty amazing under so much pressure, given the fact that it really is a pressure cooker because of the time frame. And there's no
yeah,
time, there's no room for error, there's no time for error, and they haven't committed any errors. They've been spectacularly successful on the money front, which is you absolutely necessary in the day and age we are running campaigns. No qualms there. I think a flawless convention. So I've been really impressed. And, it's no easy thing to merge the staffs that she did, bring some other people on and layering as you do, but with seemingly little friction. Which I think is a real accomplishment to management skills there. And she's a very appealing character, and I think what
yeah,
we've seen is that the more people see her, the more they like of her, and it's so that's her persona is very helpful too, and it's just who she is. But I don't really have much in the way of criticism. I think there's been some second guessing of what emphasis to put on Trump versus the kitchen table and all that. I think you have to do it all, and she's doing it all,
yeah.
and I think that's going to work to her benefit.
Right. Jim Messina, who, of course, ran the 2012 reelection campaign for Barack Obama, was quoted recently as saying, my party has this fucking idiotic idea that you either have to play to your base or you have to reach beyond it. And you got to do both. And she's doing both. And I thought that was such an insightful, comment, because I never remember, even with the Biden campaign, a sincere and well organized effort to reach out to disaffected Republicans. At the same time, she is advancing a progressive agenda that's far more liberal than anything Biden came up with. So there's not really a contrast. You can walk and chew gum at the same time. It's kind of been my impression.
Yeah, I don't know what that is, but that's having operated now in Democratic circles for a number of years. That kind of thinking is endemic. I think in 2022, the debate was how much to emphasize abortion versus healthcare. These things are not mutually exclusive, as Jim said, and
Right.
the right campaign covers it all, and it's just it's just a flawed way of looking at it, I think.
We also get so in our heads about policy and strategy. You said something I think is really accurate. You have to have a likable, great candidate. And she is likable. And I think the campaign has figured out how likable she is. So just in the last 2 weeks, she is going everywhere. She's on every kind of media outlet, podcasts, radio, local, black media, mainstream media. The more people see her and hear her, the more they like her. And the opposite is true with Trump, which is why he's hiding and going to places like New Mexico, in the last week of the campaign, and he won't do 60 Minutes and he won't do, another debate. It does seem like you have the perfect demonstration of a problem candidate and a candidate who is her best spokesperson.
Yeah, and completely unafraid to go into a Fox News interview,
Yeah,
which just shows the tenacity and the fearlessness, really.
yeah,
And I think that people love that.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
think you're seeing the opposite of Trump. You're seeing in the final days here, hiding, only going into extremely friendly environments. And I suppose their theory is they're going to find even more new troglodyte voters to come out of the woodwork.
Right.
I don't know how many more there are. I mean, he did get more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016, which was
Right.
frightening enough. So we'll see.
I have a dear friend in the administration who said he's going after the angry divorced dad and the incel vote.
Yeah.
Those are the two groups that he is like appealing to: anger, domination, crude, crass, obnoxious, stupid.
Yeah.
Those are his folks. And he's really taking it all the way. So let's say once again, Harris wins. She has a very narrow advantage in the Senate. She has a few seat advantage in the House. In terms of priorities, what do you think the Democratic base wants to see first, or at least wants to see in the first year? What are they most focused on, or what do they think needs to be done first?
Well, I think some of the priorities she's put out there. I mean, housing, I think, is one.
Yeah,
I think that addressing this, the cost of living, is another. So those have to be really key. But I would put, hopefully in that first year, I would put the
right.
Supreme Court on that agenda. I don't see why not. Voting rights, now, the filibuster is the big issue there. You may
Right.
have to just have either a number of carve outs or just get rid of it altogether.
Yeah,
I'm not sure how that works out, but it's definitely impediment.
right.
And so, I think some of the priorities she's laid out, and then I think there are some others.
Right. Yeah, my theory on the filibuster is put the tough immigration bill on the floor. And if Republicans try to filibuster that, that's where you break the filibuster,
Yeah.
because then she can go to Republicans and independents and say, I wasn't trying to jam through some wacky liberal thing. This is what you guys wanted. This is the only way you can get stuff done. And then once it's gone, and she can, do the rest of her agenda. I also,
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
yeah, I also keep trying to remind people, including people in the media who don't seem to understand this, how are you going to get your tax bill through? How are you going to get the tax bill? The Trump tax cuts expire in 2025, folks. If they don't play ball, all of it goes away. This was the position that Barack Obama was in, if you remember. And he relented and allowed some of the Bush tax cuts at that point to go forward, but not the ones for the higher income. She's
Right.
got the cards on this. And it's, everyone has either developed amnesia or they just don't get how it works. But it's the Republicans who have to negotiate their way into preserving parts of the tax bill. And I hope Democrats have that attitude. Like, you got nothing. If you don't play ball with us, you got zero. And I hope they have that spine. I hope they have that fortitude.
Yeah, I do too. And I hope that they get some, even though the margins are going to be slim,
Yeah.
I hope there's enough of a mandate that really does put the backbone in them.
Yeah. One of the things I worry about, it's, the tightrope act, suddenly there's no net, is if we are right and we get a Democratic president and a Democratic majority in the House, this will be the first time in a while we've had that without Nancy Pelosi leading it. And I readily admit I am a fangirl. I think she is the best speaker in our lifetime, maybe in the history of the country. Her ability to push through legislation on the narrowest of margins to keep everyone satisfied and in line is, I think, second to none. Do you think Democrats are going to be able to do that without her at least formally steering the ship, although she presumably will still be in Congress? Do you have faith that they've learned enough over the years not to tear each other apart and get pulled in 16 different directions?
I do. I think she's kind of changed the culture a
Yeah.
bit of the Democratic caucus. And I
Interesting.
think Hakeem can build on the skill set that she had and be able to maneuver as well as she did. Although it's a really tough act to follow for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, people should absolutely read her book. It is so fascinating and revealing, I thought, in a way that she has not done before. She begins the book with the attack on her husband and the trauma that caused. And she's not a sharer in terms of her inner life. But I thought it was really an extraordinary book, really interesting. It's sort of political junkies. It's like a must do.
Yeah.
So I would be remiss, since I'm in the middle of it, if I didn't ask you about the refusal of the Washington Post, now USA Today, LA Times, to do endorsements. And moreover, this sense that many of us had that for a good deal of the campaign, maybe until like last week, that they were normalizing Trump. They were trying to play ball with him. They were soft pedaling a lot of what he was doing. What's your overall kind of view, you as founder of Media Matters, of course, which is invaluable? I find it so frustrating and so difficult to understand this kind of yin to be fake neutral people when democracy is at stake. What's your kind of analysis of what's going on in the media in general, and whether there's something different that we can get to at the other end?
Yeah, well, I think this is a special case because it's Trump. But generally speaking, I remember I was still in the right wing when Gingrich took over Congress, and there
Right,
was an incredible demand for conservatives in the media, and the media was bending the knee, and you had a whole flood of suddenly newly minted pundits on the air, and the need for balance and all this. So that's always going to happen. But I think in this case, um, the correct view of this is that in 16 the media helped elect Trump, and even some of their more vociferous critics, his most vociferous critics now, were part of that. And I've changed too, so I'm not holding anything against anybody. But it was widespread that he
yeah,
had free reign. His rallies covered, 24/7. Hillary's speeches, I mean, one on the Supreme Court that was incredibly prescient, got virtually no coverage. And then, of course, the obsession with the emails. So
right,
that was 16. Then I think um, something pretty good happened after Trump won, which is the elite media um, really did try to hold him to account.
right,
And in a sense, not in a sense that they were biased, but in a sense they joined the resistance,
yes,
and really did some great reporting, both the Times, the Post, and other places, but particularly the Times and the Post, putting resources in there and shedding a lot of light on what was going on. My fear, which I think is starting to be borne out, is that as soon as we got into the campaign season again, and this was a real horse race, that you would get this kind of creeping false equivalence, creeping normalization, the need, so called, to cover them equally, but in the same way, as if they're the same animal, which
right,
they are not. These are different animals, and it
yes,
requires a different kind of coverage. And so, in a way, uh, the media never really, except for during his administration, never really figured out how to cover him in a campaign context. Blew
yeah,
it in 16, and has been a source of frustration. At least if they haven't blown it this year, it's been a
right,
source of frustration, and it's palpable. And so, as far as the endorsements go, it's just a piece of what we've already been seeing, I think, which is that tendency to the better he does to accommodate. And also, the other factor is accommodating conservative criticism.
yeah,
So people are afraid to do the right thing because of
exactly,
backlash, and they are very. We do have Media Matters, but on their side, they are very well organized on this issue of just hounding and pounding on the
yes,
media for a liberal bias that largely doesn't exist. But
right,
they put the fear of God in newsrooms, and so
correct,
that's a factor too. The Trump supporters out there really intimidating.
yep,
And that's what it is intimidation of the press. And so you do see a bending over backwards to accommodate that kind of criticism, even if it's subconscious. It
yes, yeah,
happens.
yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. You know, we are more and more dominated either by big corporations that have interests in front of the federal government or billionaires who have interests before the federal government. And boy, has it been, driven home to me that this is a problem. Is there some other way you can organize the media? I mean, there's a ProPublica. What would insulate it from this inherent bias that corporate media has, billionaire media has? What could you come up with?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, there are nonprofit models out there, and a ProPublica model is one. But if you're going to be in the realm of for-profit media, you're going to have this kind of ownership,
Yeah,
and the thing that we need is accountability. And I think even accountability by readers. And we're seeing that with what's going on with the cancellations at the Washington Post. Not that that's necessarily the best idea in the world, but it is an expression of accountability and of strong feelings that
gosh,
what happened was wrong, and they're delivering a message at least. And
yes,
so you're gonna have to hold these corporations' feet to the fire.
right,
We've done a lot of work at Media Matters with the platforms, for example, with
yeah,
some success, but not with Musk so much. In fact, he's suing us. Side note. But with Meta, we've tried to work to get them to enforce their own rules, and we
yes.
have had some success with that. So it's really just grinding it out, I think, and making sure that we shine the light when these lapses occur, that people know about it, and then you build up maybe some antibodies against it.
I think that's exactly right. Um, I want to ask you about two outlets and what you see their future is. Let's say Trump does lose. What do you think happens to X? Does Musk lose interest in it? Does he keep it as this, mouthpiece because he likes to have his voice heard? What do you think he does with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. A little hard to know since he's an erratic figure. But
Yeah.
if I had to guess, I would say because he's an erratic figure, the interest could wane. And he seems like out on the trail, he's riding a high. He's
Yeah.
on some kind of high. And that kind of energy is hard to sustain. And I think he could crash if and hopefully when they lose. So I don't really know the answer to that, but hopefully it could go back in a direction where it was more useful
Yes.
and more fair. But it's hard to see that under his ownership.
Yeah. And of course, we come back to Fox. Um, they have taken their lumps. It's not only the major $787 million settlement, but the sexual harassment cases and the rest of it. And they still have outstanding litigation. Have they changed in any way that you can perceive? Are they getting, quote, better? And what is their future, given the fact they have this aging audience, and no one under the age of 40 that I can find watches television at all?
Right. Well, I don't think you could say they're getting better. No, I think it's a business model to be a propaganda arm of the Republican Party. It's a
Yeah.
business model that works, and even though they've had that setback in that lawsuit, um, I haven't seen anything that you would consider better behavior. Now, the pressure on Fox campaign has always been about changing other people's view of Fox,
Yes.
not Fox itself. So there was. So I think that's been very successful. I think people now understand what
Yes.
it is, and then the other is deterrence of having what I've called the Fox effect into the rest of the media. So I could cite you chapter and verse back to 2008 stories about Obama that easily moved on to CNN. You don't
Yes.
see that as much anymore. And so Fox has been contained to some extent, and I think that's a good thing. As far as its future goes, I mean, typically, alternative media thrive in opposition. So
Yes.
they should do, they should probably do pretty well under Harris. The thing that's different is there's no center of gravity in right wing media anymore. Rush
Yes.
Limbaugh died, and it's not. Fox can be something of an agenda setter, but there's so many other voices out there. There's so many. It's become so diverse, and you've got the Ben Shapiro's, and you've got the podcast, and you've got all sorts of social media stars that it's diffuse, and so they don't have the they really were a center of gravity for a while, and I think that's faded, although the business model still works.
Yeah, it is funny when you have something new and they haven't figured out whether they should be for it, against it, whether they should be criticizing. And, there's that moment where they're all kind of looking at each other and they don't really want to say anything because they're not sure what the party line is yet. And I find that hysterical when they do that as they're trying to, figure out which way to go. I would also say that I completely commend Kamala Harris for revealing Bret Baier as the flunky non-newsman he is. For her to go on and show him up as nothing but a partisan hack doing the work of, frankly, their nighttime lineup, Sean Hannity and the rest, I thought was brilliant, because not only did she do fine, she did more than fine, but she revealed him to be such a hack. And I wonder if that has helped in your effort to contain, as you put it, I think it's a great expression, contain Fox and label it as a non-news organization. It's not news.
Well, it definitely does help. And so, we've been doing this at Media Matters for 20 years, and it took a long time, really, for sort of elected Democratic leadership to understand what a threat
Yes.
Fox was. And now, they know what it is, and she played the game and she outplayed him. And that certainly moments like that really do help, because it was very clarifying. She was also very quick on her feet to catch that.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so altogether, that was a big win, I think, because Bret Baier is a real irritant, because even in mainstream media circles, he's considered more of a so-called straight newscaster, which is baloney. That
Yes.
show is skewed, and it's as dangerous because it is skewed,
Yes.
and because he's got the veneer of the newsman. It's more insidious in some way. So I was very happy to see that, and you do see Democrats are not afraid to criticize Fox these days.
And I have to commend them. There are only two of them, frankly, that I think have reached this. But you do have examples of Democrats who use Fox beautifully. Pete Buttigieg has made a career out of going there, hijacking their programs, hijacking their audience. And the other one is Ian Sams, who is a spokesperson who's in the administration now for the campaign. They have figured out how to do it. And you wish you could kind of clone those people, because the other way of kind of dampening Fox is to inject truth into the bloodstream, and they can't stop these guys. They may stop inviting them, but they break the plane, they break the fourth wall and say, no, 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 this is not right. You people have been lied to. And that I find tremendously satisfying. Whether it's working or not, I find it satisfying.
Yeah, well, you don't know. There probably is some portion of the Fox audience that is tuning in, and not a big portion, but some portion that thinks they have better production values or something,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
and that they're entertained by it, and they're not in the Fox bubble, so to speak.
Right.
So I think it's great, and I think those things go viral.
Yes.
Pete's appearances often do, and so it reverberates beyond the Fox network, and it's another example of how to take them on. Yeah.
Got it. So, from the book, from the campaign, from this whole wacky experience we've been in the couple of years, do you think Democrats have learned how to fight? And I mean that very sincerely. I think Democrats have always had this notion that somehow they had to live up to not only a higher standard, but really not get in there and not recognize what they were dealing with. Do you think they figured it out?
Well, one indicator of this, I think, was the section of Michelle Obama's speech where she talked about the double standards that
Yes.
Kamala is subject to. And that told me, I mean, that was very different than when they go low, we go high. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
it told me something about the direction or the barometer, so to speak, of how much appreciation there is for what we're up against, and how to effectively call it out. So I do think it's gotten better. I'm always nervous, though. And I'm still always nervous in any
Yes.
real fight that you're going to have, a weak response. But I haven't seen that in a while, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think that is absolutely perfect. It's been the conversion of, Michelle Obama from they go low, we go high to just knock them on their asses.
Yeah.
And the country will be better off for it.
Exactly.
Um, David, thank you for the book and thank you for all you do. Americans, progressives, have really no idea how important you are to the cause of democracy. Media Matters, all of your fundraising, all of your organizations. You are a national treasure
Yeah.
and one of the best dinner companions I have ever had as well.
Well, thank you
So
so much.
thank you.
This was great to do, and I really appreciate the time.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
And that was David Brock. I think the takeaways from our conversation, which I thoroughly enjoyed, were we have to stop revering the Supreme Court as if it is not a political body, because it is. They act like politicians, bad politicians, and we should treat them like politicians. And that means ethics, that means term limits, that means potentially expanding them. And I think the veneer has just been ripped away. As David said, whatever the reason for Thomas's greed, whether he wants to, as he said, stick his finger in the eye of the elites or whether it's just greed, he is no longer operating in any sense like a judge, let alone a Supreme Court judge. And you can say the same, frankly, about Alito. And we have to come to terms with the fact that it's not a proper court. I don't think the answer is simply to politicize it more, but to the left, but to help restrain it and push it back into its original role, which is critical. It's to keep check on the other two branches and to guard the civil liberties of the American people. So the way to do that is to force them to behave like a court, even if they don't behave like that on their own. And that's why I think ethics is the place to start. I think Republicans would be embarrassed not to go along with that. The public overwhelmingly, if you look at polls, 80, 90% want an ethics code for the court. And frankly, maybe John Roberts would like that. He can just say, well, this was forced on us. I couldn't stop them and we'll just have to live with it. So I think that's a good approach to dealing with the court. But what I really loved about David was his just no nonsense, clear eyed view of what we are dealing with. We're dealing with a political party that, as he said, is not the same animal and doesn't have the same animal running as the Democrats do. They are different. They have taken themselves outside of the Democratic compact. Their media is not legitimate news media, it's propaganda. And Democrats have to be prepared to fight, to expose, to label, to shame, all of those things. And fortunately, I think in Kamala Harris and the people that she has attracted, she's learning to do that. And she has learned to do that. I think it's great having a prosecutor as president of the United States because, boy, do these people know how to drive an argument. And I think she has run an outstanding campaign, as David said, and I agree, not a single misstep. So now it's a matter of running through the tape and winning it in about a week. So there you have it. Thanks so much for joining us. If you like our programs, please tell your friends. They can get us wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.